set up your camera, you take your photo, and you expect it to come out like this. But instead, it turns out like this. Well, in this video, I'm going to show you a few common beginner mistakes that can be solved very easily with these tips. So the first mistake that I would see is not creating a visual path. So in the image right here, if I were to frame the photo with the edge of the frame right here up along this tree just outside of it, and then right up here so that you get a little bit of this trunk, then you would have kind of a foreground leading down here, so you get a bit of a visual path that your eye can follow this branch up through all these logs and then to this tree. You kind of have this path with these three trees here. So just to show you a better example, I have this image from my portfolio here. As we look around this one, you can see that your eye kind of goes from the bench that's on the dock right here. It follows the actual dock out to the bench and kind of continues through this part where there aren't any reeds, all the way up to the edge of the reeds. You kind of follow along the horizon of this boat, to this larger building, and then you kind of have these wavy patterns in the clouds that continue that path. Here's another example from one of my favorite photographers, Joe Cornish. In this image, you can see the visual path he's created using this stone fence that we have here. It kind of leads you through the frame all the way up to that mountain, through all of the trees. And then you have this large swoop of cloud cover that kind of adds a curve to the whole visual path. The next beginner mistake that I frequently notice is not using the histogram. So for my exposure right now, you can see my camera says we're at +3. But if you look at, and so it should be about properly exposed. But if you look at the histogram, you can see that we have a lot of information right up in here. That's all of these stripes that you're seeing on the screen. That's the sky in the background. And the camera is gonna want to meter for the trees and all of this that you can see right here. And so when you bring into the sky into the equation, it's going to still be trying to meter for these tree trunks and everything. So you're going to get these pure whites in the sky, and we don't always want that. So just something that's important is to pay attention to your histogram. So if I speed up my shutter speed, you can see things moving down in my histogram. And now we have more information in the sky and we're not clipping it as much. The second mistake is not knowing when your meter gets it wrong. If you try to expose and your meter says it's perfectly exposed, you might actually have an incorrect exposure, and you might be blowing out your highlights. Your image might be way too bright or way too dark, even though your camera thinks it's perfect. And your histogram is just another tool to let you know where all of the exposure information on your image lies. It's just a really helpful tool to judge brightness value of certain parts of your image. This is important because if you expose incorrectly in camera, you might not be able to bring it back in post if you overdo it in either direction. So using your histogram will help you keep an eye on your image and how bright or dark it is, so you can get it exactly where you want it. This also becomes different when you're in manual mode versus aperture priority. When you're in aperture priority mode, if you choose an aperture, your camera's gonna change the shutter speed to get it to what it thinks is the correct exposure. So if it's wrong, then it will take the picture that way because it thinks that that's right. This is why the histogram can be really nice, because you can keep an eye on it in order to know whether or not the camera is incorrect or correct in its exposure, and then you can roll your exposure comp dial in order to fix that. It can help you know when or when not to intervene in the camera's settings if you're using a partial auto mode like aperture priority. So for example, if it was too bright of an image, I would roll my exposure compensation down and it would darken the image. The camera would think it might be a stop underexposed, but it's actually the exposure I want, because that exposure might keep all my highlight detail in the sky, for example. So this tip's a little bit easier, but basically just make sure you have your horizon straight in camera. Mistake number 3 really is that simple. Just get your horizon line straight in camera. It's just much easier. Most cameras nowadays will have a actual line on the back or some type of indicator as to whether or not the camera is level to get the straight horizon that you want. But again, in most scenarios, you're gonna just want to get it straight in camera. It's very easy, and it really only takes an extra half a second to verify that your shot is level. The biggest problem with having an uneven horizon really is that most people that are doing it did it by accident, and it looks that way when you are, as a viewer, looking at their images. If you are tipping the horizon on purpose, that's great. If it aids your composition, then that's fine. As long as you have a reason to do it, then it's okay. And if the viewer thinks it's an accident, it just makes the photo look worse to them. Just to summarize all the mistakes, I have this final photo here. As you can see, our horizon is straight, so we're not making that mistake. And then the second mistake was to watch our histogram, which it looks like our highlight detail could get pushed a little further. So I'm going to actually rearrange some of our settings here. Looks like we're pushing into pure white. Just gonna bump that back, and that seems about right. You can see our camera thinks that we're underexposed, but if I were to bring us up to being exposed, we would lose detail in the highlights here, and they would be overexposed in pure whites. So sometimes the camera's metering isn't always right, so it's nice to know your histogram. And if you remember our first mistake, it's not making a visual path. And as you can see here for our visual path, we kind of have this stronger element within our frame that are these leaves here, and then you kind of curve around the lake up to these brighter trees up here, which also kind of swirl around the frame like this. You have this other larger tree. You can just barely see there's a path here that kind of swirls around and helps guide this whole visual path that you can see in here, and it kind of keeps your eye moving throughout the frame. If you feel that you've learned something from this video, please leave a like. Thank you for watching this far, and have a great day.